Prime Denis CYPLENKOV versus Prime Levan SAGINASHVILI. Quite possibly the most desired hypothetical matchup in all of arm wrestling. Both athletes completely dominated the scene in their own time. But because of Denis's health issues, even now in 2024, we have never been able to see this match take place. So in this video, we're going to weigh each athlete's advantages and disadvantages, analyze the style of each opponent, and then make an educated guess as to what this match would look like. Let's begin. Starting with Levan SAGINASHVILI. Firstly, let's take a look at Levan's advantages. Levan's advantages are everything. Moving on to Denis CYPLENKOV. No, just kidding. But seriously, it's kind of difficult to even narrow down what stands out when it comes to Levan because everything stands out. Levan's elbow flexor is quite possibly the strongest in history. His cupping is incredible. He can hook, he can top roll, and he can even press. Even his endurance seems pretty solid. But if I had to pick one thing that stands out with Levan, it probably has to be his hand. Levan's ability to take hand control is unmatched by anyone else in the sport. The combination of Levan's wrist and his wrist flexion make him pretty much impossible to go over the top of. The only person who even came close to doing something to Levan recently totally lost hand control and then went underneath him. Levan probably has stronger cupping than anyone in the history of the sport, meaning it's harder to top roll him than anyone else. But again, Levan's cupping only slightly stands out to me because all of his weapons are insanely good. So what about Levan's disadvantages? Levan's disadvantages are nothing. Moving on to Denis CYPLENKOV. Okay, sorry, I'm out of jokes. Any weaknesses Levan had in the past as far as specific muscle groups go seem to have been eliminated a long time ago. We haven't seen any glaring weaknesses in Levan's game since he lost to Sabin Badalescu 100 years ago. The only pattern I have noticed in Levan's game that isn't ideal has more so been due to his size. Levan is around 400 pounds, and when you're that massive, you just physically cannot get as close to the table as you might want to be. So what sometimes happens with Levan is he will completely take hand control from his opponent, but then he will struggle to actually pin his opponent and finish the match. We saw this most clearly demonstrated in the Hermes Gasparini match. Even though Levan had full hand control, he couldn't really get close enough to his hand to make the same adjustments someone like Devin Larratt would have been able to make. If Devin ever found himself in this position we see Levan in right here, the match would be totally over. He would simply make tiny adjustments over time, eventually ending up in a full press position while maintaining hand control, never giving his opponent a moment to breathe. But Levan was not able to do this. He did make one brief transition attempt, but you could tell that he wasn't super confident with it, so he just dove right back into the top roll. And it worked out for him in the end, but maybe not as clean as it could have been. But I'm being very picky here. Overall, there are basically zero weaknesses in Levan's game. Moving on to Denis CYPLENKOV, we have a totally different kind of athlete. Denis is not nearly as balanced of an arm wrestler as Levan is. He has some pretty clear advantages and disadvantages. The biggest advantage of Denis is obviously his bicep. Denis's bicep is still claimed by many as the strongest ever. He maintains the wide grip strict curl record as far as I'm aware, and he holds the world record for longest time holding Dave Chafee in the dad move only using your bicep, which was 7 hours. Pretty sick. And this brings us to another one of Denis's advantages, and that is his endurance. It's difficult to find an arm wrestling match where Denis gets a stop and then ends up losing. Most of his matches with Andrei Pushkar, his match with Dave Chafee, Richard Lubkes, and many more all were long drawn out wars with Denis spending a significant amount of time in the losing position. But still, he wins every single one of these matches eventually. Even Devin Larratt, the endurance king, talked about how he is not totally sure that his muscular endurance is superior to Denis CYPLENKOV. Another thing that Denis can do very well is pull from awkward positions. In some ways, Denis CYPLENKOV is like Michael Todd's big brother. He will hit sideways without his wrist, he will king's move, and he will dive behind his arm for an ugly flop press. He can do all the moves that most people wouldn't want to do from a safety standpoint. And now, let's talk about Denis's weaknesses. Of course, most people know by now that Denis's biggest weakness is his cupping. Denis's hand is just so thick that it creates a ton of torque on his hand whenever he is trying to curl his wrist in. For Denis, doing a normal wrist curl would be like doing a wrist curl with a fat grip. Everything is just a little bit more difficult. Now, of course, this can also cause his opponent some difficulty as well. This is why so many Denis matches result in him and his opponent losing their wrist and having to fight from the ugliest positions. Additionally, Denis normally does not fight for a grip in the setup. He pretty much gives his opponent what they want. This often leads to him having a leverage disadvantage once the match begins. Okay, now that we've talked about advantages and disadvantages with both athletes' arm wrestling styles in mind, let's try to imagine exactly what this match would look like if it were to take place. This is what I think would happen if prime Denis CYPLENKOV went up against prime Levan SAGINASHVILI. This match would of course be for the #1 spot in the world, so it will be a 6-round format. Both athletes approach the table and Levan sets up in a very traditional high knuckle posting top roll. Denis, on the other hand, sets up with his classic low grip. This low grip from Denis gives Levan the ability to maintain his high knuckles without covering Denis's thumb knuckle. Both athletes slip and we go to straps. Inside of straps, we see the exact same setup, Denis with the low grip and Levan with the high grip. Upon the go of the match, we see Denis drag back and attempt to bend his wrist, but he soon realizes how hopeless of an endeavor this is. Denis loses his wrist, and he is also underneath Levan's hand because of the lower setup he implemented. Levan has full control. He stares into Denis's eyes and then slams him to the pad. In round 2, Denis tries this exact same setup once again, only he tries it even harder. But unfortunately for Denis, the exact same thing happens again. Levan takes everything, stares at him, and then slams him to the pad. Things are not looking good for Denis. But then, Denis decides to do something different. He decides to pull an old trick out of his bag. He changes his setup and grips as high up on Levan's hand as he possibly can. Denis is now fully committed to the open top roll. This time upon the go of the match, everything changes. Levan tries to bend his wrist like he has in the previous rounds, but this time he is unable to do so. The match is stopped in the center table for around 30 seconds as Levan attempts to regain wrist control. Denis has cracked Levan's wrist back, but Denis has also entirely lost his own wrist in the process. Levan surges sideways without his wrist, but he can't finish. Eventually, Levan gives up his wrist entirely, fully commits to the flop press, dives onto his own arm, and he is able to pin Denis using this move. The score is now 3-0 in favor of Levan. In round 4, once again we see Denis using the higher grip, but this time Levan puts much more intentionality into his wrist rise. He does end up losing his wrist again, but this time he is much higher out onto the hand of Denis CYPLENKOV and has much more control of the high ground. He makes a few adjustments and eventually he transitions to the flop once again, winning the match 4-0, but not without significant difficulty. Levan maintains his streak of never losing a single round in a professional super match. And there you have it. That's how I think a hypothetical match between prime Denis CYPLENKOV and Levan SAGINASHVILI would go. Denis is insanely strong, but in the end, I think that Levan is probably even stronger, he is more technical, and he just has way too many options. I also think that the style match works against Denis here. But let me know who you guys think would take this match if it did happen, as well as what lane you see the match taking place in.